Hey, what's up? This is Mark at alchemist.camp, where we learn Elixir and Phoenix by building things. Today, I'm going to continue the Ecto Basics series, which, if you're following the playlist as it is after this recording is released, you should have just seen the Ecto Overview series, where we talked about the repo a little bit, about how it's different from Active Record. If you haven't seen that video, definitely go back and check that before heading on to this one. And today, what we're going to do is I've already set up a simple project, and I've already created some tables in a database, and I've already configured everything so that we can just see Ecto in action. I'm going to show you some simple queries we can do with it, and just give you an idea of what it's like to work with and how much you can pull from what you already understand about SQL to use Ecto, and uh, just get a basic feel for it without having to go through the trouble of configuring everything. We'll do that next video after you've got a little bit of context from this one. So let's get started. This is a very minimal Elixir app. I'm not using Phoenix. Don't have any dependencies at all except for EctoSQL and Postgres. That's it. And I've created a configuration where we've got a database, linkly.dev. I've already created that with mix ecto create. And I'm just going to pop open the terminal here, and we'll connect to this database with Postgres. So PSQL, linkly dev, and you can see we have the following tables in it. We have bookmarks, link tags, links, schema migrations, tags, and users. I've got an overview file here. I'll just show you quickly so we can see what all is involved. So this app is called Linkly. It's a clone of Delicious, or actually it's kind of like a backend only clone of it, since this is a database series. It's got users with usernames and emails. There are links that people bookmark. A bookmark is basically a link ID, a user ID, and a title. So user one might bookmark my site, alchemist.camp, and give it the title uh, Elixir Tutorials, something like that. Um, Different user might bookmark the same site, but give it a different title, or the same user might bookmark lots of different sites. The same user can't bookmark the same site repeatedly, though, because that would just be a bit strange. I don't even think your browser will let you do that. Then there are also tags. You can tag something as interesting, or maybe in my case, I would tag a bunch of things with Elixir and just filter by that tag and follow that. Um, that will actually be something that I'll add to the app later, interests, where a user can follow a given tag. But for now, these two will be left off, and we'll just be looking at these. So tags, and then finally link tags is a join table, which keeps track of which user tagged which URL with which tag. So, for example, uh, different people might tag the same article with different categories, since they would see it a little differently and do something a little different with it. So that's what we've got in the database. I used Ecto to generate some migrations. If you've worked with something like Rails before or Laravel, this should look very familiar to you. You can tell from this syntax, it's basically just creating tables, and you can set up some indexes, and there are some other restrictions you can put on things. For example, in my join tables, like the bookmark table, we have to say what happens if the thing being referred to gets deleted. So, say there's a link that a lot of people have bookmarked, and the admin of the site realizes that URL is a spam site, or it has something malicious on it. They remove the link from the database. What happens to all the bookmarks? Well, I said we'll just delete them all. Similarly, if a user is deleted, all of their bookmarks get deleted. Um, got add tags, really the same kind of thing there. The last thing I would point out is when there's a unique index that's specifying multiple attributes, that means it's unique across all of them. So like the same person could tag many different links, or one link could be tagged by many different people, or the tag interesting could be used on many sites or be used by many people, but the same person can't tag the same site with the same thing repeatedly. Like I would never tag elixirlang.org with the tag elixir twice. I would just tag it with elixir and maybe tag it with resources and then move on. So that's what we've got in our migrations. And now let's look at some sample queries. So the very top, now these are things I'll be pasting into the interactive terminal, but very top are some things that you'll often have at the top of files where you're working with Ecto. I'm importing ecto.query. That's because there's a DSL for writing queries that look very similar to SQL queries. So you can just say from users, select ID, something like that. And that's valid Elixir if you've imported this query DSL. Importing ecto.adapters.sql, just because there's a bunch of stuff in there that's useful. And actually, I don't need to make this an import. I think I can just make this an alias. Yeah. So if you import, you can type everything in that module without the module name. For example, if we import ecto.query, we can access ecto.query.from by just typing from. If we aliased it, we'd have to type query.from. And since we type from all the time, that would be a little bit of a pain. We're going to import it. Then I'm aliasing Linkly, which is the name of this project, .repo, which is the Ecto repo that is the thing between the user and the database, as I explained before. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is just insert some data. So here are some links for 3 different sites. Here are 2 users, Alice and Bob. Why are we not? You know what? Let me get out of Vim mode. This has happened a few times. Toggle Vim mode. Okay. And now it should be much easier to copy paste. Yes. Okay. So I'll just throw all this data into the terminal. And this isn't going to actually run anything. This is just going to define some variables that have all the data. Let's fire up IEX. So IEX dash capital S mix will let us start up the mix project and have it running interactively in the terminal. Paste all that stuff in the terminal. So now I should be able to type users to insert, and we'll see got Alice and Bob. This inserted at, this updated at, this is just the timestamps that we had in the migrations. So over here we have email, username, and then timestamps. This automatically generates inserted at, updated at. So just had to have something in these example queries. So I just threw in the current time. All right. With all of that done, we should be able to just start inserting them into the repo. So repo.insert all users and users to insert, just as we have up here. Then returning is going to say what the function will return after we run it. So returning the ID of the users that we've added and the username. Username. There we go. And looks like we have a mistake because there was no closing quote. I'll close the quote. We'll get an error. Then I'll go back and do this correctly or not. Let's see here. Users to insert. Repo insert all undefined module. Repo is not available. Oh, I must not have gotten the alias copy. So alias linkly.repo. Now repo. Okay, repo is available. Go back, run that. Okay, so we got two things inserted. That's what this first two means. And here's the ID and the username and the ID and the username. Pretty much just what we expected. We can see the same when we insert the links. Got three links and their IDs there. Then on bookmarks, I didn't add a returning. I just had repo dot insert all bookmarks and bookmarks to insert. And so now we see there were four that were inserted, but they're all nil. Let's take a look at what they were. We can do that with repo.query, which will let us just use pure SQL syntax. There are no safety things that have been added to this, so I would just do this when kind of messing around interactively from the REPL like this, but I wouldn't put this into my application. Select star from bookmarks, and we can see we have these are the IDs, and then these are the titles, and then this would be the user ID and the link ID, and then the timestamps. So that looks pretty decent. How would we get this same query except, or how would we get just the titles of the bookmarks? Well, we can use as the query syntax, the query DSL, I should say, to build up just that. So we can say from bookmarks. So that's the name of the table in quotes. Select title and just pass it that atom. So that is y is from. I guess I must have missed a few things here. So import ecto dot query. Okay, so we have a query there, and let's look at what the SQL for that query would be. So we can find out that with repo.toSQL all and then query. And this is the SQL that Ecto would insert. Now you can see here we are escaping the strings, so this will prevent an SQL injection attack, and that's why it's so much safer to be working with this DSL instead of just your direct SQL queries. So let's run the query. So we can do that with repo.all and our query. So we got just the titles of all of the links. Okay, now let's move on a bit. So this example, get user to, should still look very familiar to you if you're used to Ecto. So from you and users, where u.id equals 2, select username. That's going to get the second user. Repo.all get user to. And here we go. That's Bob. That same query could be done in plain SQL with, let's see, that would be repo.query, select username from users where ID equals 2. And you can see Bob. So there are multiple ways to do things. In general, it's a better idea to go with this syntax. There's also another syntax where it's a macro syntax, and you're piping one thing into the next, into the next, into the next. I can show you an example really quickly from my own site, Alchemist Camp. Let's see, or maybe I can't. Not very conveniently without closing this, but you will definitely see it later in this series. All right. You can also explain this SQL.adapters.explain will give you a little bit more information about what a query is doing. And undefined function get Bob. Oh, I haven't defined that yet. So get Bob is pretty much just like get user to, except we're getting by the username instead of by the ID. And note that both of these have from you and users, and then we say where u.id and u.username instead of just saying from users and then where. Actually, I'll type out both versions. That's probably a good idea. So first I'll paste in get Bob. Okay. So this get Bob that we have down here is the same thing as if we said get Bob equals from users where username, or actually got to have the colon on the other side, username, since it's a key and the value is Bob, then select ID like so. So we can use an atom syntax, or we can temporarily create a variable here and then refer to it with u dot whatever field. Um, in general, this syntax is easier. This one is sometimes necessary if you're dealing with multiple tables in the same query. Okay, so you can see both cases here. It's the exact same thing. Repo dot all Bob and get Bob. That should be, and we see what Bob's ID is. So all pretty straightforward stuff. Now let's look at something a little bit more complicated. So we'll make a get bookmarks function that just gets all the bookmarks, or I should say we'll make a get bookmarks query, and we can see all the bookmarks, the link IDs, the titles, and the user IDs. Now let's look at get Alice's bookmarks. So we can build up a query. Now this should look very SQL like to you. From B in bookmarks, where b.user ID equals 1, because that's Alice's user ID, select user ID, link ID, and title. So notice we've got the atom syntax here. We can't specify that these are from a different table. These are all going to be from the bookmarks table. So and then we repo.all to run this. So you can see we have link ID, title, and user ID. But what we really want to do in most cases where we're looking at a bookmark is we don't want to just have the IDs of the links and the IDs of the users. We want to have the actual name of the user and the title of the link. And that's what or I should say the URL of the link. And that's what this more complicated query does. So from you and users, where u.username is Alice, then we join b in bookmarks on b.userid equals u.id. So if we had the atom syntax and we just had colon ID, there wouldn't be any way of knowing which table that ID was on. So we wouldn't be able to do this query. It would be ambiguous and we'd get an error. Join ln links on b.linkid equals l.id. Then we select the username, the URL, and the title. So this is a significantly more complicated query, but it also gets us a much nicer output. Repo.all get Alice bookmarks 2, and now we can see the name and the URLs and the titles. That's the main low-hanging fruit. There is one more thing I want to point out, though, because it's really confusing for people getting started, and that's this pin operator you see here. We could make a query to get all of the users who are named Bob just by saying by name equals from you in users, where you dot username equals Bob, no problem with that. However, if we wanted to make the name a variable and we said name equals Bob, and then we did this, there's no way for the Ecto DSL to know what this name is. And in normal cases, we would be interpolating the name. But since this is actually running inside of a macro, there has to be a way to tell it that this name needs to be interpolated before you execute all the code that it's going into. And we don't have the pin, we'll get a compile error that says exactly that. So we have an unbound variable name. If you were attempting to interpolate a value, use the caret and the var. We call this pinning. So if we want to use the variable, we say where username equals caret name, and that's going to be the already defined variable name where name equals Bob up here. So once we do that, now we can run our repo. So we can say repo.all by name. And what didn't work here? Where does it have a schema? Need to oh right, it didn't have any select in there at all. That's because I was just about to use it in an update all example, but let's just do this correctly. So we'll just say by name Bob, and where username equals name, we'll select ID and username and email. And now we can run that and we get all the information. Now, in the query that I set up where we didn't have a select, we can pass that into repo.updateAll. So in Ecto's repo, most of the time, I would say most of the time, you'll be using repo.insert and repo.update. Those can only be used if you have a schema, though, and we haven't defined any schemas at all. So if we're working with these manually built up queries like we have here, we need to use insert all and update all. Insert all and update all don't add timestamps by default, which is why I had to add all of these. But in a lot of code you see, we don't have anything for timestamps. That's because insert, repo.insert, repo.update take care of that for you. So just a small thing to keep in mind in the future if you see something where it looks like there should be timestamps, but there aren't. All right, so let's look at this one. What is this doing? Well, repo update all by name. So that's basically going to get all of the users where the username is Bob, then set email to robert@example.com. Right now, Bob's email is bob@example.com. And this should return one result since there should only be one user with the username Bob. Let's try running that. Repo.update all by name, set email robert@example.com. And close the parentheses, and there we go. Now, if we look at all the users, repo.query select star from users, we'll see Bob now has an email of robert@example.com. And we can use that same query we just passed into the update all and pass it into delete all. And that will delete every user that matches that. As you can guess, this is a pretty dangerous function to be using, but just for completeness, I'll throw it in here. So repo.delete all and by name. And we are now down one user named Bob. So that's just a quick overview of some things you can do. We're going to look at schemas next, and schemas are actually really powerful. They'll save a lot of time, and you'll see why uh, this is such an unfamiliar way to work with Ecto for me, even though I've been writing Elixir most of the time for the past 3 years. Hope this was useful. If so, if you want to learn more about Ecto, then definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel, and I will see you on alchemist.camp.